This is the Sports Bash Warm-Up with Josh Hennig on 97.3 ESPN. Now, live inside the Matt Black Kia Studios, here's Josh Hennig.
Well, one coach told me, young teams are the teams to watch out there because they're the ones who rely the most on the lift from the home court. Joel Embiid was actually a player that was called out to me by a team specifically who said he's a guy who really thrives on the home court. He plays to the crowd a lot. He lets them lift him and lets them carry them.
Keith Smith of Yahoo Sports on the Sports Bash yesterday, just dropping that little nugget on all of us. Keith Smith joins Mike Gill, Hunter Brody on the Sports Bash each and every week on a Wednesday. He was the guy ahead of everybody on the Disney World, the NBA going there and all that jazz. There are people in the NBA who believe that no fans will hurt young players, and Joel Embiid could be one of them. We'll get to that and more coming up this hour on the warm-up. Josh Hennig here with you. Text board is open, 609-403-0973 to get on the conversation. 609-403-0973. We've been asking for many weeks. You guys listening, those of us who are on the air on 97.3 ESPN, we don't really have an answer for it. But we've all asked the question, what is going to be the impact of this situation where there's no fans in the stands? And we got a bit of that answer, at least speculative answer, from Keith Smith, Yahoo Sports, NBA writer yesterday on the Sports Bash on 97.3 ESPN. So we got to get into that. Plus this hour, our 97.3 ESPN.com Phillies Insider Frank Klose will join me coming up at 1:25. We'll talk about what is going on with Major League Baseball and how all of this can impact the Phillies, because the Players Association are coming back at Major League Baseball with their own proposal. And it feels like a lot of this, the issues between baseball, the owners and the players, have a lot more to do with money, while the other sports like basketball and hockey don't seem to have that financial problem. So we'll get into all of that and more coming up with Frank Klose here on the warm-up on 97.3 ESPN. And as I mentioned, the text board is open at 609-403-0973. I couldn't go a day. I couldn't go 24 hours and not talk about that little nugget from Keith Smith, because he straight up is telling you, look, I had a coach tell me that this no fans thing could affect the young players. And one person specifically pointed to Joel Embiid. And we always ask about, why are the 76ers so much better at home than on the road? And it's been suggested by some that it could be a maturity issue, why they're so much better at home than the road. Well, if it is a maturity issue, could a part of that maturity issue, I ask now, be that Joel Embiid, as is stated by these people in the NBA telling Keith Smith of Yahoo Sports, are these people in the NBA suggesting that young players in general feed off of a home crowd and are more dependent on a home crowd than we've previously given them credit for? I think it's a fascinating question, because so many times when we watch the 76ers, whether it's myself or you or anybody out there, we all get frustrated with how this team performs on the road. And it's not just this year, it's every year. Every year it seems like for the last couple of years, this team has either underachieved or underwhelmed us on the road every season. And this year, it's just an extreme difference between what we see at home versus on the road. And it just makes me wonder, is this just another example why this team is just not ready? Why this team is just not ready to win a championship? And I'm not saying that the Sixers can't win a championship. I know everyone wants to point to they had a chance to win it last year. But it seems like there are certain teams that are just much more dependent on the home crowd than they are the others. There are some teams that are just much more well constructed to handle what goes with a road environment. And Keith Smith goes on to talk about the teams that could be impacted the most if they don't have a home court advantage in the postseason.
And they called out the Miami Heat and the Philadelphia 76ers as two teams who really took advantage of good home crowds. They were very supportive and got behind the teams, and they're clearly not going to have that in this environment where it's going to be completely closed to fans.
So teams like the Sixers and the Heat, they feed off the home crowd. They need that home crowd to get up and going. Is that going to be the difference in this postseason? That teams like the Sixers and the Heat, because there is no home crowd to get them juiced up. There is no crowd for them to feed off of. There is no home crowd to rattle the opponents. How could that impact the NBA playoffs? We saw during the Last Dance Jordan documentary, they talked about the Pacer fans and the Jazz fans, about how Jordan didn't even want to bring his kids to Utah because of how volatile the Jazz fans were. We saw all the pictures of the video of the people in Indiana, how intense of a home crowd that was. You remove that element altogether from the NBA playoffs. I mean, talk about separating the men from the boys. This could be the ultimate equalizer when it comes to basketball. We talked yesterday on the warm-up here on 97.3 ESPN. I gave you the audio about how there shouldn't be an asterisk next to this season, as Adrian Wojnarowski of ESPN was pointing out. Well, maybe the asterisk should be in the opposite direction. Maybe, just maybe, because there is no fans, we're going to find out who really should be the champion when all things are equaled out. When you take away home court advantage, when you take away all the variables that come with travel and being in one city versus another, how many hours of travel, overnights, etc. You take out all those variables. You take out some of the distractions that come with the postseason, that come with, there's no Jordan driving to Atlantic City after a game. There's no questions about what fill-in-the-blank player is doing the night after a game. There's no issue about a team flying in early one morning, got to play that night. They're taking away all these variables from these teams. And now you're forcing these teams to go out there and just say mano a mano, who's the best team? And if, as Keith Smith states, that there are people around the NBA who look at the Sixers and look at the Heat and look at these other teams, and they get up there and they say, those teams are really successful because when they're at home, they can feed off that home crowd. And a guy like Joel Embiid needs potentially a home crowd to get him juiced up. Could we see a lesser version of those teams when they return? Not just because we haven't played basketball for 2 months, but because of the fact that without the home crowd, we're not going to see the same level of energy from those players. 609-403-0973 is the text board. And is basketball the one sport that is the biggest factor with? We all know that some sports, home field advantage is a big deal. We know, for example, in football, if a team has to come to Lincoln Financial Field, or if a team has to go to CenturyLink in Seattle, or a team has to go to Arrowhead in Kansas City, that those home field advantages are considered some of the best in the NFL because the crowd has an effect on opponents. So if there's not going to be fans at these NBA playoff games and these NHL playoff games, how could that affect the Sixers and the Flyers? Now, I think for baseball, it's a little different because there's a lot of times that when you watch baseball games during the regular season, there's a lot of games where there are barely any fans there anyway. So it's hard to really gauge how much the fans impact a game on July 11th versus a game in the postseason. But for specifically the postseason, I am very interested to see what the impact is going to be for the Sixers and Flyers. Because if the Sixers are such a great home team and they're just a bad road team and you take away the crowds altogether, are they somewhere in the middle? I'm curious to see how the players themselves handle this. A team like the 76ers, if they're 29-2 at home, but they're 10-24 on the road, what are they then? Are they somewhere in between without a home crowd on a neutral court? Are they closer to the home record or the away record? I'm going to say it's probably somewhere in between. Because if Joel Embiid is feeding off the crowd, and certain teams do better in certain environments when the crowd is behind them, when they can feed off the energy of the people in the building. If the players can't feed off that energy anymore, maybe some of these teams with these great home court advantages, these home court records that they have, maybe it neutralizes an aspect of their game. And it maybe either slows them down or takes away a little bit of the edge. Keith Smith mentioned the Miami Heat. They're 27-5 at home, 14-19 on the road. So if you take away that home court advantage, the Miami Heat, for example, are 41-24 overall. The Sixers are 39-26 overall. So what do? Do you take away potentially 6 games from the Sixers, 6 games from the Heat win-wise? Does it make them close to a 500 basketball team? How many teams are that dependent on their home court? You look at a team like the Milwaukee Bucks. They have 28 wins at home and 25 on the road. A team like the Toronto Raptors, they have the same exact record at home and on the road. I would think for those two teams, a neutral site doesn't impact them. I look at a team like the Orlando Magic, for example. 16-15 at home, 14-20 on the road. It's only a 2-win difference. Are the Orlando Magic maybe going to be okay in a neutral site environment? The Celtics only have 3 more wins at home than on the road. So looking at the teams that have a less of a margin of difference between home and road, could those be teams that are going to be okay and going to be all right in the NBA playoffs compared to the Sixers, for example? I think that might be the case. And if that is the case, I think I'm concerned about the 76ers and their ability to overcome this. I have to question if the Sixers are so dependent on home court advantage, could that mean that the 76ers are in a place that they have a chance to potentially be less of an NBA threat for the postseason? I don't think we can overlook it. I don't think we can overlook the fact that the 76ers are a team that, when it's not at home, could that be a bad thing? When you look at the 76ers and realize that there are questions about this team going into the playoffs, Ben Simmons coming off of an injury, there's questions about how they would handle a neutral environment. And we're going to have Ben Golliver of the Washington Post back on tomorrow when he was on the show last here on the warm-up on 97.3 ESPN. He listed the Sixers and the Rockets as 2 teams with the most questions entering the playoffs.
I think it was the Sixers and the Houston Rockets that actually entered these playoffs with the most questions and the most potential, volatility in terms of maybe having stuff blow up this summer. I could have easily seen the Rockets, if they go out early, needing to make some major moves with their roster. And I could say the same thing for the Sixers and even for Brett Brown himself.
So if the Sixers underachieve this postseason and they don't reach a conference finals, and part of it has to do with the fact that they don't have that home court advantage, that they're playing in an environment where they can feed off of the crowd, where there's probably either nobody in the crowd or just a handful of executives and family members in the arena, in these small arenas down in Orlando. what that can mean is the Sixers underachieving could push this organization to make bigger changes than we maybe realized. And if they're going to make some bigger changes than we realized, I mean, doesn't it get back to the question about, I asked this week, stability? The Eagles, in my opinion, have an advantage in the NFC East because of the stability of the coaching staff, the front office, and a huge portion of the roster's core from one year to the next. We all highlight Malcolm Jenkins leaving, but Jason Kelsey's coming back, and Fletcher Cox is coming back, and Zach Ertz, and Carson Wentz. Major parts of this organization are coming back from one year to the next, each and every year. And it was Ben Golliver, who joined us here on 97.3 ESPN just a couple of weeks ago, who pointed to the Sixers making so many roster changes, potentially being a problem.
They've made so many changes already. I think that partially adds into this thing, right? It becomes this situation where, you're bringing in Horford, you're bringing in Harris, you're trading out younger pieces, you're flipping, the front office at various points over the last 5 years. And I think that creates a certain climate, and it potentially limits how much you have buy-in from all these guys because they're wondering, hey, am I going to be next, or is this plan going to change?
609-403-0973. 609-403-0973. I'm genuinely curious. Could this be a domino effect? If, as Keith Smith says, that the Sixers, because Embiid and others can't feed off the home crowd, they maybe have less success in the postseason. And then, if they have less success in the postseason, that leads to more changes this offseason, which could be more instability for this team, more new pieces for Embiid and Simmons to adapt to and grow with and develop with. And if you fire the head coach and you bring in a totally new system for next year, a season that, if you go by what the NBA is saying, they're probably going to start the season in December next year. You're probably going to have, again, if you go by all the information that's out there, if we just encapsulate it, if the NBA gets back to playing in Orlando for their whatever it is before the postseason in late July, and as Keith Smith said on the Sports Bash yesterday on 97.3 ESPN, it's probably going to continue into late September. And then your off season is October and November, and you're right back at it again in late December with a regular season for the NBA. You have a quick turnaround. You have a disappointing season for the Sixers. Maybe you get rid of the head coach. Maybe you trade Al Horford or whoever else to make more changes on the roster. This pandemic that we're in may impact the Sixers more than any Philadelphia sports team. Because when you look at all four teams, whether baseball does or doesn't come back, I don't feel like the pandemic is directly affecting the Phillies season 100% because of the fact that all the teams are kind of on an equal footing when it comes to baseball. They're all stuck in this neutral mode where they didn't even start the season yet. You look at the Flyers, they're in a great position. They have a chance to move up in the seeding for the playoffs because of this situation, and they have a head coach in his first year. There's a lot of promise with this young team, young goaltender, a lot of talent. The Eagles, as long as the NFL starts on time and everything goes as we expect, the Eagles will be the one team that has stability from one year to the next. We have high expectations for this team, considering they made some improvements at interesting positions like wide receiver and defensive tackle. They made interesting adjustments to the secondary. There's a lot of excitement and interest in the Eagles. The Sixers may be the team that has been the most impacted negatively by the environment we are in. 609-403-0973 is the text board. Tom from the Villas chimes in and says, they may not have the home crowd to feed off of, but the Sixers don't have the road fans getting in their heads. Silence is golden. It may not affect them at all. That's Tom from the Villas. Well, what I would combat you with, Tom, is that what is the differential? Like, how many wins did the home crowd give them versus how many losses did the road crowds give them. I don't know if there's a definitive number that we can give, but if I were to say that the Sixers had 6 more wins at home because of the home crowd and maybe, 6 more losses on the road? So if you flip that into the win-loss standings, you're talking about a team that should probably be closer to 33 and 32. And a team that's 33 and 32, they're barely hanging on ahead of the Nets and the Magic in the 7 and 8 seeds. Now, maybe it's less than that. Maybe it is in 6 games. But we can't overlook the fact, Tom in the Villas, and I appreciate your text, that there is a number of wins versus losses that this team was impacted by. There was a number of wins and losses that this team specifically gained and lost because of the home and road. And when I look at a team like the Milwaukee Bucks and the Toronto Raptors, teams that have close to almost identical home versus road records, you have to wonder, they may be in a better position to go to this neutral site than teams like the Sixers and the Miami Heat that have these extreme differences between home and road records. One more text before we hit the break, 609-403-0973. Rob from Bayville chimes in and says, no crowds, someone count Markelle Fultz, triple-double every night. Markelle Fultz is an interesting question, because I got to ask Mike Gill about this. Where does his bet stand? Because he has a bet going on right now with somebody that if Markelle Fultz scores NC with a certain number of points, that he wins a bet. How does all this affect his bet? I mean, I'm not trying to, distract the point, but, Markelle Fultz has actually had a solid season in Orlando. He's had some really good stretches of games. I don't know if it's less about the crowds, Rob in Bayville. Maybe he's need to get out of Philadelphia. Maybe he's just not built for the big city. Some guys are just not big city players. Remember the whole story with Zach Greinke, who has played in multiple cities. One of the reasons why he didn't be traded from Kansas City to a city like New York because he was worried about how he would handle a big city, and he got traded to Milwaukee instead, and then he ended up in Los Angeles anyway, and then he followed it up with going to Arizona. I mean, he's a very weird guy. He's not a real big media guy, not a really talker. Listen, maybe some guys are just not well suited for the big city environment. And maybe Markelle Fultz is one of those guys where he had to separate himself from Philadelphia, from a city that is so close to his hometown in Maryland, and go all the way down to Florida for him to be successful. Everybody's a little different. Some more of your texts coming up next here on the warm-up on 97.3 ESPN, 609-403-0973. Coming up next, Frank Klose. We'll ask him about that. What team is the Phillies maybe impacted, one of those teams, by this pandemic, plus the latest on Major League Baseball, trying to get back on the field, all of that and more. Josh Hennig here on the warm-up on 97.3 ESPN FM and the 97.3 ESPN mobile app, powered by First Bank of Sea Isle City. Josh Hennig back here on the warm-up on 97.3 ESPN. Get back to your text messages in just a minute, 609-403-0973. But as promised, joining us right now on the Boardwalk Honda Hotline, Frank Klose, 97.3 ESPN.com.
Has been hard on
one of the problems when you pull up certain websites, they have ads on them, so you got to pot the pot down. But we still got Frank on the phone line, despite the fact of my little snafu there with the board. Frank, you got a new article right now on 97.3 ESPN.com, basically doing a little bit of an overview for everybody out there about what is going on with this owners versus players debate. And before we get into some of the details, I just want to ask you, just off the bat, does it feel like that there is a larger gap between the players and owners than there ever has been in recent years?
I don't know if it's bigger. I think they've always had major gaps if you look throughout baseball history. I mean, certainly there was a strike back in 1994, and they didn't have a World Series that year. It's the biggest in a while. I think for the most part, the labor relations between Major League Baseball and the union have been pretty good in the last couple of years. In fact, they worked out some rule changes without waiting even for a new collective bargaining agreement. So that was kind of a sign to me at the time that things were good. that they don't have to wait until there's a major showdown between the two sides to work something out. But it seems at this point there's definitely a stalemate, and I think the stalemate comes because back on March 12th when spring training shut down and Major League Baseball a couple weeks later came to an agreement with the players that they would earn prorated salaries for games played. They worked it out. They agreed to it. And now it's different. And the reason why it's different is that Major League Baseball did not anticipate that they wouldn't have fans in the stands. Like, they did not even think of that as a possibility back on March 26th. And therefore, they feel that they can change the terms of the deal. The players say, well, wait a minute, we made a deal, so there's nothing else to discuss. And that's kind of the holdup right now.
You mentioned about the fans in the stands, and this is a topic that's been brought up a couple times. Can you give a little bit of information about how baseball, divvies up some of that money? Because I know that, for example, there's different sets of revenue. There's the revenue from tickets, different revenue from merchandise, different revenue from the national TV contracts. Then each team has their regional sports network contracts. So, how is the money broken up, and how does that affect a team like, for example, the Phillies?
Well, one thing that I'm pretty sure changed recently was that the visiting team doesn't necessarily get a cut anymore. I think it's more about your home revenue, and any revenue sharing would account for discrepancies in revenue. But I will say this, that, a lot of the money comes from broadcast deals. One problem with that is the Phillies made, for example, the deal that the Phillies made with then Comcast Sportsnet, it was a 10-year deal for $1.5 billion. Well, there's a lot of teams that can't say that they average $150 million a year on their TV contracts. Some teams in small markets have very low revenue from their TV contracts. Some have a lot. Certainly the New York Yankees, owning the Yes Network, are going to bring in much more revenue than the Milwaukee Brewers in a smaller market, sort of overshadowed by Chicago. So there's a lot of disparity with those types of revenues. MLB.TV, teams get their cut. That's another big revenue booster. In fact, actually, they sold MLB.TV a couple of years ago, and every team got a really nice check. So, but yeah, it really varies. And obviously, the teams that have more attendance than others bring in more ticket revenue. Teams that have more fans than others bring in more concession revenue. So there still seems to be, aside from those national TV contracts and MLB.TV, that's kind of dispersed more, maybe more evenly. There's a lot of disparity between the two teams. So right now, a team like the Pittsburgh Pirates, a very lovely stadium, and I always enjoy attending. Their revenue is way less than a team like the Phillies or the Yankees and Red Sox, of course, who are the two powerhouses.
So, Frank, what can there be a resolution to get baseball back on the field? Because we all know that everybody has to compromise. But as you write in your article at 973ESPN.com, people believe there will be a compromise. But what would that compromise have to look like, in your opinion?
The one thing I've been saying for a few weeks is that they're going to have to essentially say to the players, well, we'll pay you the rest later. I can't imagine them getting out of the contracts that they've already signed. I think when it comes down to it, they're going to have to pay the contracts that they agree to at the prorated rate that they agree to. Now, they might not agree on the number. Here's another sticking point too. If you're doing that and you play 82 games versus 100 games, that's a very different amount of salary. You're either taking home 2/3 of your salary or you're taking home half of your salary. But I think ultimately what's going to have to happen is baseball is going to say, look, we'll pay you the salary you agree to, but you have to understand we're taking a huge interim hit, and you have to sort of let us pay you the rest later. And I think while that will get this deal done, it's not going to hurt the player. I mean, it's not going to be good for the players in the future anyway. It's going to hurt the players when next season's free agency hits and the following season, because ultimately the future contracts will be determined based upon the revenues. But I think baseball wants to be, at least in terms of the Players Association, wants to be sure that they get paid what their contract says they're going to be paid.
We know that guys like Max Scherzer and others have mentioned about the fact that they want to see these financial records that the baseball owners are working off of with this information. And we seen, for example, Gary Bettman said on SportsCenter yesterday, Frank, that there's no negotiations for hockey with their financial structure because everything is pretty much bracketed. And then for basketball, players and NBA insiders have both said that in basketball, the players are 100% on board with whatever the league does because they're partners. So, why is it that the players and the MLB owners can't get on the same page with financials?
Well, baseball's union is pretty strong. They came to the current union structure after many. There's all kinds of stories of the past when a player won an MVP and then the team imposed a pay cut on them. There used to be a system where the players had no control whatsoever, and thanks to Curt Flood's famous holdout from his trade to the Phillies, free agency was born, and ever since then, it sort of set up a particular structure where the union is in this mindset, and Major League Baseball is in that mindset, and that those collective bargaining agreements have really been ever since anti-salary cap, anti-revenue sharing, and it was really because it was kind of set up that way from the start. Sometimes, you ever heard the expression, you can't put toothpaste back into the tube? I think for people that are in this MLB Players Association union, they said, all right, well, we fought for this, and if we give it up now, then we'll lose it. So I think they're trying to hold on to their rights there, and the union's not without merit too. I mean, these books need to be open because if they're saying that the players have to take such a hit because they're broke, Max Scherzer, case in point, he's one of the better paid players in baseball. So somebody who makes $30 million a year seems to stand to take the biggest hit from this, at least percentage-wise. So it's almost like this deal tries to pit him against the younger players who are just trying to make their major league minimum or as close to that as possible and go about their day. And maybe their 2 years in the major leagues has to, basically be the brunt of their earning power in their lives. There's just so much wrong with this, I think, in terms of the way it was structured that hasn't gone over well with the players. And Scherzer basically speaking out as a veteran. Yeah, well, show us. Show us it's that bad, because the teams, the players just don't believe it. And one thing I want to point out too, the value of franchises is something constantly growing and growing and growing. Like, whoever would have thought that the Kansas City Royals would be worth $1 billion when, not that long ago the Florida Marlins were selling for $150 million. So the growth in baseball franchise values, I think, has been growing at a 12% clip, which is a lot every year. And so if you are a player in the Players Association, you say, okay, fine, your books might not balance evenly for 2020. However, your franchise is still going to grow in terms of its value, and that should be part of the equation as well.
Frank Klose joining us here on the Boardwalk Honda Hotline on 97.3 ESPN. Make sure you check out his article right now on 97.3ESPN.com, basically detailing about a lot of the pessimism and the issues that are basically halting a lot of the progress for the start of the MLB 2020 season. And speaking of that season, Frank, I wanted to ask you specifically about the Phillies, because I opened the show saying about how this pandemic, how it could potentially impact a team like the 76ers. Now, the Phillies in baseball is a totally different animal than it is basketball, because one, baseball is starting their season, basketball is resuming their season. But what could be some of the negatives or positives that could come out of a shortened season for a team like the Phillies, not just for the regular season, but for them moving forward?
Well, on Tuesday, I wrote a piece on 97.3ESPN.com about the 2019 team and how they would have fared if the season ended after 82 games. And I think it helps the Phillies in the short term, because Jake Arrieta did okay up until maybe July last season. The demand on somebody like him, whose rotation spot being the third starter, is something the Phillies absolutely need to work out in 2020, because let's face it, we went to the offseason and we heard all kinds of things. Yeah, the Phillies are going to add two starters. The Phillies are going to add two starters. They added one. So it's helpful to the Phillies if they can get through a season with Jake Arrieta not breaking down. And 34 years old is old in baseball years for a starting pitcher anymore. So you kind of hope that will help them. It also will help them that, in a sense, depending on how the rules play out and depending how rosters are made up, you can kind of catch lightning in a bottle with some of the young players, you often hear about new players coming on the scene that are very talented, and then the league adjusts to them. Well, if you have Spencer Howard or Alec Boehm, maybe they hold them back a little bit, but when you get to, halfway through the season, however long it is, if you kind of let them loose, the league might not have the time to sort of make adjustments to them and for them to readjust. So I could see that working on both ends of the spectrum, that sometimes the young players will give a little bit more pop. And maybe for some of the veteran players that had a little bit of rest now, it'll help them pitch a full season without injury. So a team like the Phillies, I think that can help them next year, especially since the starting rotation is going to be a key part of what their success is. So a healthy Arrieta and maybe Spencer Howard along the way. If Wheeler and Nola are pitching well, then that starting rotation might be good enough for the playoffs.
So let's play off of that scenario then. If the Phillies are a beneficiary of a 82-game, 102-game, whatever season, let's say they get to the playoffs, they have some sort of level of success. I'm not saying they're going to win a World Series, but maybe they get to the league championship, or they go the full series in the division round, whatever it may be. They have some sort of level of success. How does that then impact the off season and next season? Because we know, for example, JT Realmuto, there's questions. We know that there's questions. Didi Gregorius, from what I understand, he only signed a one-year contract, right? So there's questions about some of the guys on this team far beyond this year.
Well, I'll start with Gregorius. I don't see him, and I never really saw him more than a one-year stopgap. If Alec Boehm rises to the major leagues and he's not a disaster, which nobody really expects him to be, there's your replacement in the infield. So that's going to be kind of covered for the Phillies going forward. But Realmuto, I think that the Phillies actually kind of benefit from this shutdown and those negotiations, and the reason being there's a lot of financial uncertainty right now. As I mentioned a while ago, even if the players are being paid deferred amounts of money for this season until teams can sort of catch up to the revenue, that's going to impact free agents later. There's going to be less money to go around in future seasons. And so, the Phillies, whenever they're allowed to talk to him again, that there's still a hold on negotiating for some reason, even if it's with your own players. I think if they put a nice contract in front of him and it's really good, I think he might be more compelled to sign. Let's be honest, the Phillies have higher revenues than other teams. There's not going to be the Pittsburgh Pirates in on JT Realmuto, for example, especially the teams that are most hit by this. So I can see him saying, you know what, we don't really know what these salaries are going to be like going forward, so this deal's good. Maybe now's a good time to take it.
He is Frank Klose. Check out his work at 973ESPN.com. His latest article breaks down everything that's been going on the last 24 to 48 hours with the owners and the players union, and also all of his coverage of the Phillies, all at 973ESPN.com. Also, give Frank a follow on Twitter at Frank Klose. Again, our 973ESPN.com Phillies Insiders. All guests Frank appeared here on the Boardwalk Honda Hotline. Frank, appreciate you jumping on and giving us all the latest information here.
Hey, great to chat with you, Josh.
Josh Hennig here on the warm-up 97.3 ESPN. We'll get back to your text messages coming up next at 609-403-0973 right here on 97.3 ESPN FM, leading up to the Sports Bash with Mike Gill and Hunter Brody coming up at 2 o'clock right here, 97.3 ESPN FM and the 97.3 ESPN mobile app powered by First Bank of Sea Isle City. Josh Hennig back here on the warm-up on 97.3 ESPN. Thanks again to Frank Klose for joining us to give us some more information about what's going on with baseball. Listen, I'm not going to say I'm the most optimistic person when it comes to baseball. I understand there's a belief out there that baseball will come to their senses, but I'm just not 100% on board with this idea that we're just going to get this all figured out in about a couple of weeks and baseball will be playing in July. I don't know. I'm not feeling 100% optimistic. I don't feel about baseball the way that I do about hockey and basketball. I feel like those two sports, there's a lot more symmetry, and there's a lot more there's a lot more communication and a lot more desire to work together when it comes to the situations with the NBA and the NHL than it is with Major League Baseball. And the NFL can just kind of sit back and wait for everybody else to kind of figure it out before they actually have to do anything. And that's the benefit that they have because, with the UFC having fights, with NASCAR doing what they're doing, the PGA Tour resuming in June, there's a lot of other sports for them to see what they're doing that opens the door when NBA and the NHL come back. The NFL can kind of just sit back and be like, hey, man, we're just observing right now. Back to the text board right now. There was 609-403-0973. We opened up the show talking about the impact of players like Joel Embiid and the Sixers and other teams, how this pandemic can impact them. There's not going to be any fans in Orlando. I mean, unless you consider maybe someone's wife and kids in the stands. That could be really the only fans that there might be at some of these playoff games. They're going to be played in the proposed Disney Wide World of Sports complex in Orlando. Nick in Summers Point chimes in at 609-403-0973. He says, watch this be the year that the Sixers end up winning a championship just because everyone will say, yeah, but you won it that year, although there will always be an asterisk next to it. This is Nick from Summers Point. Well, Nick, as we talked about yesterday, let's be realistic. There's an asterisk next to everything. This is not just a this year kind of situation. The whole world's going to have an asterisk next to it. Adrian Wojnarowski said this. We played this cut yesterday on the warm-up, and this is what he had to say about the asterisk idea. Because let's be realistic, and I agree with him. There's an asterisk next to everything right now.
There is an asterisk on everything in our worlds right now. There's an asterisk on my son's junior year of high school, my daughter's sophomore year of college. It is not what anyone expected. Remember that, there is so much that the process of getting to anything this year was so dramatically changed. Why would we think the NBA's champion would be treated any differently? Just like probably whoever wins the World Series in baseball.
So and this is me, Nick, from Summers Point, and I can't speak for anybody else, but if anybody's going to hold it against the Sixers or any team because they are the team that won a championship in the year that they had to play in Orlando, and you're going to hold that against them, I'm sorry, but I can't vibe with that. I can't roll with that. That's ridiculous to me. You got to give a team credit for being the team that won a championship during everything that's going on, for being the team that wins a championship when the whole world is coming down on them, being the team that won despite all the odds being against them. I can't hold that against the Sixers. They won the championship. In fact, if they win the championship this year, you got to give Embiid and Simmons and Brett Brown and everybody credit for being the one franchise that was able to get it together and to persevere beyond the odds. I mean, there'll be a doggone 30 for 30 documentary about, it'll be from the process to the Colangelo Twitter bombs to winning a championship in a pandemic, the 76ers story. I mean, it's going to be insane. So if someone's really going to put an asterisk next to them winning a championship this year, I cannot rock and roll with that negativity. But I appreciate the text, Nick, from Summers Point. 609-403-0973. Lawrence from Dover, Delaware chimes in. He says, the fans will definitely have an impact. No fans will definitely have an impact, but I think the players are just excited to get back out there. They definitely are excited. And all the interviews I've heard and seen of different NBA players, seeing their tweets, it appears to me that when you're talking about NBA players, they just want to go out there and play basketball. And they're a little bit less concerned about all the other stuff because there is a belief that the league will convey to them and communicate to them all of the variables. They'll communicate the safety protocols. They'll communicate about transportation. They'll communicate about logistics. The players seem to have this attitude of, look, we'll have this all figured out. So when we come back and play basketball, we won't have to worry about a lot of this stuff. And even a guy like Patrick Beverly has come out and said, hey, listen, if I got to take a bunch of tests and get this thing stuck up on my nose, I'll do it. I don't care. I feel like for the NBA players, you're right, Lawrence from Dover. For the players, there is an attitude of, look, we just want to go out there and play basketball. We want to resume our season. We want to get back out there and have a chance to win a championship for those of us who are playoff contenders. I know that according to NBA insiders, there are some NBA teams like the Hawks, for example, that would like to get it back out there because more games gives their young players more opportunities to get experience. And I think you're right. Initially there will be an excitement to get out there, but in my opinion, as it progresses, as each week goes by, and as the energy that comes with the return and the anticipation dies down, and the adrenaline wears off a little bit with each game, with each week, and with each game, and you have to focus more and more on the situation at hand, I think that there not being fans there will definitely separate from the men from the boys. And listen, for the Sixers, I do have concerns about what that will look like for them in a world where they don't have that fan support, that they don't have however many games that fan base in Philadelphia has garnered for them. If a guy like Embiid feeds off the crowd, how many wins does that account for? Is that 3 wins a year, 6 wins a year? I don't know what the full number is, but I'm assuming there is a number placed on that. 609-403-0973. Dan from EHT chimes in and says, specifically Embiid at home, he really does feed off the crowd. And you're right, Dan, he does. Dan also chimed in a text that says, there is sort of an asterisk next to many championships over the years, especially recently. And he points to the Patriots and the Astros cheating scandals. I believe, yes, you're right about some of these teams, but I feel like you can come up with a caveat for every year. Like the year LeBron won the championship. Well, if Draymond Green didn't get suspended, would the Cavs have won? Or the Warriors' first championship. Well, if Kyrie and Kevin Love weren't injured that NBA Finals, would the Warriors have won that first championship against LeBron? I just feel like you can come up with an excuse for every champion. What if this didn't happen? That's why I don't like to live in the world of what if, because at the end of the day, the Patriots still have to go out there and play the game. The Astros still have to go out there and play the game. There's no guarantee that any what if variable actually did win or lose somebody a game or a series or a championship. What ifs are just that. They exist in a world that I don't live in. They exist in a world that doesn't actually exist in reality. I can't factor in variables that don't exist.